Well, for the past 2 weeks, we've been talking about how not to be your own worst enemy. And today we're going to wrap that up. We're going to look at preemptive habit number 3, and we'll kind of wrap this thing up. And I thank you for the time you've given us the first couple of weeks. I want to start by introducing a term to you today that I'm not sure you're familiar with, and it's the genetic fallacy term. It's also known as the fallacy of origins and the fallacy of virtue. So, what's all that mean? Well, a fallacy is an error in reasoning. For example, horses and cows both have 4 legs, right? So, if I had a horse that had 4 legs, then my horse must be a cow because a cow has 4 legs. Or maybe a buddy of mine I know lives in a subdivision that has lots of really big, expensive houses. So I would naturally think that my buddy lives in a big, expensive house. See, a genetic fallacy takes place when someone discounts the reliability of information based on the source rather than the merits of the information. For example, if I said today that I had a report that I wanted to share with you from CNN, half of you would just turn away and turn it off or whatever. If I said I heard it on Fox News, the other half of you would turn and not want anything to do with it either. See, you've already created a suspicion of the information because of the source. And it's easy to discount information based on the source rather than its merit, especially when it comes to advice. I mean, should it be judged by its merits and not on its source? If not, maybe you become your own worst enemy. And as I mentioned, this is the last part of this series, and we're going to kind of wrap this thing up today. And we can all laugh at some events when we were our own worst enemy in the past, but some of them you can't laugh about either, because some of them people got hurt. Maybe you. But so many of us make them in our career, in our health, finances, marriages, whatever. And when we're not being our own worst enemy, when we watch other people do that, we just kind of, from a distance, think, I've learned my lesson. I'll never do that. But there's always constantly looming over us the potential to become your own worst enemy. Never goes away. Because after all, as I've said earlier in this series, you have participated in all your bad decisions. That's the constant, is you. And a single bad decision is always the first step towards becoming your own worst enemy. Because again, every habit begins with the first time, and every pattern starts with the first line, and every journey begins with the first step. And in this series, we've been talking about preemptive habits, and today I'm going to share the third one on how not to become your own worst enemy. So here's a question I haven't addressed in the first 2 sessions. Why are we talking about this in this context? Church, spiritual, whatever. Well, because this isn't just about you. You see, when you hurt you also hurt those closest to you. And if you're a Jesus follower, you're responsible on how your behavior impacts other people. It's about you living your life in a way that really others are drawn to the source of life in you. Jesus. So here's a quick review from earlier. And if you haven't watched the first two teachings, I'd recommend you do that. You can find them on our Facebook page. You can go to our churchatthecorner.com website. You can go to our YouTube page and watch it there. So in episode 1, teaching 1, we looked at preemptive habit number 1, which was pay attention to the tension. While considering anything, an option, an invitation, a decision, you should ask yourself, is there a tension that deserves my attention? And remember, don't start selling yourself, because we rarely have to sell ourselves on a really good idea and the right thing. And then last time we talked about preemptive habit number 2, which was pay attention to your narratives in your life. Pay attention on how you frame reactions and responses and feelings and your self-talk. Paul told us to take all those things captive and demolish them, because our internal narratives can be helpful, but they can also set us up to become our own worst enemy. So today, we're going to look at the last habit, preemptive habit number 3, which is pay attention to the voices of wisdom around you. Most people who become their own worst enemy were warned. Somewhere along the way, they were warned by somebody, but they wouldn't listen. Maybe it's you. Maybe you look back now and go, man, if I just would have listened and taken so-and-so's advice, it wouldn't have happened. They warned me. You see, our worst decisions, those are tipping points. They're the points of no return. Man, how many times have you heard people say, if I could just go back to that decision, I would do it different? That's those moments we don't get back. So it's important to pay attention to those around us with wisdom. See, our worst decisions are always preceded by a series of unwise decisions ahead of time. Somebody felt the tension and we ignored them. See, they weren't distracted by our internal narratives like we were. They connected the dots for us that we couldn't see, and they said something. And if we'd have paid attention to the voices of wisdom around us, it would have been different. But if we will listen to the voices around us, it can become an extraordinary habit to keep us from becoming our own worst enemy. So today, I want to go back again like I did in week 1 to the Hebrew Bible that we know as the Old Testament. And I want to see if maybe this won't soften your resistance to listening to what you've heard and maybe paying attention to the wisdom of those around you. The bulk of it is found in 1 Kings chapter 12, but we're going to start out in 1 Kings chapter 11. And this narrative revolves around Israel's 4th king. You remember in week 1, we talked about Israel's 1st king and 2nd king, Saul and David. Well, this narrative revolves around the 4th king. For a little context, again, you understand that Saul was Israel's 1st king, David was Israel's 2nd king, and then David's son, Solomon, replaced him as king. So the assumption was that when Solomon died, his oldest son, Jeroboam, would become king as well. But there's another character we need to be introduced to here to really put all this together, and his name was Jeroboam. So you got Rehoboam and you got Jeroboam. And who was this Jeroboam? We know that Rehoboam was Solomon's son. Well, we read about him in 1 Kings chapter 11 with verse 28. It says, "Now Jeroboam was a man of standing And when Solomon saw how well the young man did his work, he put him in charge of the whole labor force. Now, Solomon was this huge visionary. He was constantly building things. And he had this huge slave workforce that did all the construction. So Solomon recognizes Jeroboam and puts him in charge of the forced labor, the slaves. And Solomon apparently had more than 150,000 stone cutters that would cut the stone that they would use to build these things. That Solomon built the temple. He was the one that built the temple after they'd been the tabernacle in the wilderness, and it became the first temple. So we pick up then again with verse 29, and it says, at that time Jeroboam was going out of Jerusalem, and Ahijah, the prophet of Shiloh, met him there. And if you read what happens there, it says that the prophet rips his coat into 12 pieces, his coat, not Jeroboam's. And he hands Jeroboam 10 of the pieces of his coat, and he keeps 2 of them. And he's a prophet, so he shares the prophecy that God wants him to tell Jeroboam, and he does that in verse 31, and he says, see, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. Now there were 12 tribes in the nation of Israel. So here we see that the prophet, through the prophet, tells Jeroboam that he is going to take 10 of these tribes away from Solomon and give them to Jeroboam. Why? Why would he do that? Well, King Solomon, who was David's son, who worshiped the living God, also was worshiping other gods, because Solomon had hundreds of wives. And a lot of the gods, these false gods that they were worshiping, he started worshiping as well, in addition to the one true God. So Jeroboam, once he's told this by the prophet, can't keep his mouth shut, and he goes out and starts telling people what this prophet told him. And obviously, when you do that, it gets back to the main source, especially if you were a king. So Solomon finds out about it. And so, predictably, here's what Solomon does. In verse 40, he says, Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fled to Egypt and stayed there until Solomon's death. And again, the assumption was, now that Solomon has died, that Rehoboam would be the next king because he was Solomon's son. There wouldn't be any challenges. It'd be pretty simple. He'd just become the king. So that's where we pick up the story in 1 Kings chapter 12. Verse 1. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone there to make him king. When Jeroboam heard this, he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from the King Solomon. He returned from Egypt. So he shows up. So they sent for Jeroboam, and he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, your father put a heavy yoke on us. Your father, basically what he's saying is, your father, like the other kings, treated us like slaves. That's what the Egyptians were. They were slaves. But now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke that he put on us, and we will serve you. So what are they saying? Hey, if you'll just lighten the load a little, treat us a little more respectful, we'll serve you willingly. You won't have to force us to do anything. But you need to stop all this construction. You're working us to death. You need to lighten the taxation load on us. So at this point, when Rehoboam hears this, we're going to see that he makes 2 good decisions before things go south. Verse 5, Rehoboam answered and said, go away for 3 days and then come back to me. So the people went away. Now, this was a good decision because what's Rehoboam saying? Give me a little time to think about it. You go away. Let me think about it, and then we'll talk. Verse 6. Here's his second good decision. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served with his father Solomon during his lifetime. Because, see, these advisors were older and wiser. They'd been around his father. They'd had quite a bit of water under the bridge, probably. So this was a good move, asking for their thoughts. And that's exactly what he does. Verse 6, he says, "How would you advise me to answer these people?" he asked. Verse 7, they replied, "If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants." So they're saying, hey, Rehoboam, you've never been king before. If you want to be a really good king and rule a kingdom that's united, then here's how. Pretty simple. Put their interest ahead of yours. I mean, that's wise counsel. But Rehoboam thought, apparently to himself, what do a bunch of old men know? You know what? This is a new generation. Things are a little different now. I mean, I asked them, but I don't really like what they said. Matter of fact, verse 8 tells us that he didn't, because it says, but Rehoboam rejected the advice that the elders gave him. But it's what he needed to hear. But it's not what he wanted to do. But it was actually the only way to get to where he wanted to be. But he didn't like the way it sounded. He didn't like what he might have to do. So in this case, it was a united kingdom. And Rehoboam found folks then. When I say united, it was a kingdom that had one simple thought. The people around him was, tell him what he wants to hear, so we'll get what we want. So he found some folks that would tell him what he wanted to hear. See, that's how you become your own worst enemy. If you surround yourself with people who tell you what you want to hear, you'll lose influence, opportunity, resources, and respect. This is how you end up where you don't want to be. So here's a great question, because I guarantee this is going on in your life right now. Whose advice are you ignoring? Maybe because it doesn't sound like the way you wanted it to sound. You're well on your way to becoming your own worst enemy. What is the internal narrative? Remember we talked about paying attention to them? You're using to reinforce your resistance to that advice. If there's something in you that says, what could they possibly know about this or that? You need to hit pause, because you're about to become a victim of a fallacy. I want you to hear me. Don't ever discount powerful or important advice because of the source of it. See, Rehoboam rejected this great counsel because it was from older people, and it wasn't what he wanted to hear. So let's go back to the story. 1 Kings 12, pick up with verse 8. But Rehoboam rejected the advice the elders gave him and consulted the young men. Now, let's don't read too much into that. That's not saying that young men don't have good counsel, okay? But the second part of this is where the problem begins. Who had grown up with him and were serving him. In other words, they were on the payroll. So what are they going to say? What he wanted to hear. Didn't matter the age. It was that they were serving him. So when the only people when only the people who have access to you are the ones that are giving you advice, who need something from you constantly, you're in a dangerous place. Verse 9, he asks them, what's your advice? How should we answer these people who say to me, lighten the yoke your father put on us? You know, we can always find someone who will tell us what we want to hear. They're out there. They're a dime a dozen. Because the reason we want to hear that is so we can do what we want to do. See, the problem with always going with what you want to do is eventually you will arrive at precisely where you don't want to be. Let me say that again. The problem with always doing what you want to do is you eventually arrive at precisely where you don't want to be. You become your own worst enemy. And this is what happens to Rehoboam. Because when you look at verse 10, it says, the young men who had grown up with him replied, these people have said to you, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter. Tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. Now that sounds a little weird, but let me give you some backdrop here. Solomon was a big guy, apparently. And in that culture, it was a sign of health and wealth. If you were a big guy, you were healthy and you were wealthy. So apparently he had a pretty good sized waist on him. So what they tell Rehoboam here is, hey, you need to tell them that your little finger is thicker than your dad's waist. And he was a big man. What are they saying? Hey, Rehoboam, tell them they ain't seen nothing yet. With what you're going to do to them, they haven't seen anything yet. Verse 11, my father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. Now, scorpions were a kind of whip. They just had metal and bone in them used to punish criminals. Matter of fact, that's the same kind of whip that Jesus was beat with that pulled all the skin off of his body. So Rehoboam's message to them was this: my dad treated you like slaves, I'm going to treat you like criminals. And he didn't listen to the advice that wise men had given him. Verse 12, 3 days later, Jeroboam and all the people returned to Rehoboam. Remember, he sent them away, so they all returned. Verse 13, the king answered the people harshly, rejecting the advice given him by the elders. See, the moment he rejected the wise advice of the elders, the fate of an entire nation was sealed. An unwise decision led to a catastrophic decision. And he tells them, my father made your yoke heavy, I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips, I will scourge you with scorpions. In verse 16, when all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king. They had a prepared statement, apparently, when it came back. And the next piece that we read in verse 16 is part of a quote that comes from a rebel named Sheba, who had led a rebellion during the reign of King David, who would have been Rehoboam's grandfather. Here's what it says. Verse 16, what share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? Jesse was David's father. To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David. In other words, David and your lineage, Solomon, you guys can go build your own cities and palaces. We don't recognize your right to rule over us. Go rule yourself. We're going to make it hard. Verse 16, so the Israelites went home. But as for the Israelites who were still living in the towns of Judah, Rehoboam still ruled over them. King Rehoboam sent out Adoniram, who was in charge of forced labor, but all Israel stoned him to death. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. Look at the consequences of one wrong decision not to listen to good advice because of the source it came from. They have been in rebellion with the house of David to this day. The kingdom was divided. It was weakened. It became vulnerable. Then it became invadable. And this is just like us when we refuse to pay attention to the voices of wisdom around us. Find someone who has nothing to gain or lose by telling you the truth, guys. Don't get trapped by the genetic fallacy. Here's what you should constantly ask somebody. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Now, they may never have experienced what you're asking them, but just still ask them, what would you do if you were in my shoes? It's so simple. You don't have to sell yourself on that, do you? We have to ask ourselves, why don't we do it then? One reason, I think, is we already know what they're going to say. And if you already know what a wise person's going to say when you ask them, then just do it. The other reason we don't ask is I think we don't think it's anyone else's business. Well, you know, it may not be their business. But let me tell you, you need to invite them into your business because private decisions have public consequences. Private decisions have public consequences. Your private decisions don't stay private. Wise people seek out others and make it their business to get them involved in their business. But you know, one thing I've learned is success is intoxicating. Success doesn't necessarily make us smarter. It makes us more careless. It makes us clueless at times. You know, so many fathers think this. Well, you know, I was a kid once. I know how to raise a kid. I don't need any help. Really? You know, I had surgery once. How about you let me operate on you? Here's the thing, guys. Somebody else can see what you can't see. And you need that so you don't become your own worst enemy. So I want to challenge you with another commitment. And it's this. I will not automatically discount advice based on the source of the advice. I will not automatically discount the advice based on the source of the advice. Pay attention to the voices of the wisdom around you. Because wise voices set you up to make wise choices. Every person who has become their own worst enemy, I think, would tell you that in that decision or moment, they wish they could go back and undo it. And typically, it was preceded by a series of unwise decisions. See, when we open ourselves up to wisdom, we make better decisions and live with fewer regrets. And we avoid becoming our own worst enemy. So, wrapping this up, let's look once again at our 3 preemptive habits that will ensure that you don't become your own worst enemy. The first one is pay attention to the tension. It'll be there, and you need to pay attention to it. Number 2, pay attention to your narratives. Most of them are false. And then thirdly, pay attention to the voices of wisdom around you. Guys, this isn't just for your sake. It's for the sake of people around you. And following Jesus requires that we love as he loved. We lose our opportunities to do that when we become our own worst enemy. So pay attention to the tension. Pay attention to the narratives. And pay attention to the voice of wisdom around you. Let me pray. Father, once again, we're thankful for your word and how it can change things and how it's so relevant all these years later. and will be still relevant many years later if we'll just embrace it and let it become that important part of our life. So, Father, I pray that somebody was encouraged today. I pray that maybe you got their attention enough to where they'll realize that, I've been getting good advice, but I just hadn't been utilizing it because it hadn't necessarily been what I wanted to hear every time. So help us to be more like that. Help us, encourage us to recognize that. And as we said in the first two sessions, Father, if there's somebody that came to a realization by listening to these messages that they've never really trusted you, who is the wisest voice we could listen to, that's where the best advice comes from, because it's the truth. You're the truth, the way, and the life. If there's somebody like that, Father, I pray that this morning they'll maybe send us a private message. They'll put something in the comment box where we can follow up with them, have a conversation with them, and you can become that to them. It's that simple. In a moment's time, it can happen. So, Father, we thank you and we praise you, and we do all this in the name of Jesus. Amen.